Neutrality is a interesting subject because if the reality of what's happening is so blatant, like why are you trying to find some like benefit of the doubt for the other side? That's how I look at some of the articles or the headlines where it's like, you know, Russia says and followed by a complete lie. To me, it's like, why did you even publish that? Because it's disinformation in and of itself, because what Russia has said is a lie, right? How do you look at a situation which is so black and white? Ukraine is a sovereign nation, and then the Russians invade. And like, what else is there to discuss? Like, how do you claim to be neutral if you're making an excuse for them? That's how I always saw it, right? It was always just a confusing argument to me. Like, how is that neutrality? That's just lying, basically.
Hi everyone, my name is Julia Tymoshenko, you're watching Ukrainer, and this is our series called Ukraine Through the Eyes of Others, where we talk to leading political experts, analysts, journalists about their opinion on Ukraine and Russia's war against it. And today we have Christian Borys, the founder of Saint Javelin, and this is a very unique and special interview for me because I also work for Saint Javelin, so some of these things that we're going to talk today, like I've already discussed many times with Christian, but I'm sure nonetheless it's going to be really interesting for all you guys to hear. Thank you so much for coming.
Or it might not be interesting, but we'll find out.
We'll find out. I think it will for sure. We'll talk a little bit about your background in journalism, because you were a journalist before Saint Javelin, but if you could go back a little bit to when Saint Javelin started and how it all began, why did you decide to do something like this? And did you have an idea of what it's going to be in the future?
No, I had like no idea that it would become what it became. The reason I started it was, so it was like December 2021. And then I remember that all the news started to come out about the Russians massing troops along the border. So I had these group chats from when I lived here, when I worked here, and it was like, you know, journalists, analysts, political experts who follow Ukraine, follow Russia. And people started to talk more and like more seriously about the possibility of a full-scale invasion. And like when I was a journalist, that theme was brought up. Like I would go to Mariupol and, you know, people would talk about it, right? Like, is Russia going to do a full-scale invasion? And it was like every year that topic would come up, and it almost became, I don't want to say this like lightly, but it like almost became a joke, because it was like people would say it and then it seemed like so impossible that nobody took it seriously, right? And then so then it's December 2021, and people start talking about it much more seriously because there's evidence that they're bringing troops towards the borders, right? And it's like, I'm just a normal person at this point. I'm not a journalist. I have a marketing company in Toronto, but I start looking and I start watching like much more intensely what's happening. And then I basically started to post on my own social media, which like I didn't have any followers. I was just posting to like my friends, right? And I was basically like posting stories that I saw in the news and giving my own perspective on it and saying like, this is why this is, I can't swear, but like, this is why this is stupid, right? The Russians are saying this, but this is the evidence of what they're actually doing, right? So I was posting more and more about that. And then I guess people liked my angle as a former journalist who now had no like neutrality. I was very obviously pro-Ukraine, and I was giving my perspective from like my perspective. I wasn't doing it as like a neutral journalist, right? So people started to find it funny, and it was like getting shared and whatever. And then it was February 15th or February 16th. And by that point, Biden had already indicated that we know what the Russians are doing. They have every intention of invading. It's just a matter of days. And I believed at that point that, yes, it was going to happen. So a friend of mine had told me that he had printed Saint Javelin stickers. And Saint Javelin was this meme that existed, but like very few people knew about it.
It's very interesting because a lot of people think that Saint Javelin was something that was like coined as a term after the invasion.
Yeah, I don't even remember like the origin of the name or anything like this at this point. People thought I designed it. Like, I don't know how to draw, so I definitely didn't design it. But February 16th, a friend of mine told me that he had printed the stickers and he had just like sent them to friends and stuff like that to have on their laptops and whatever. And I thought that was a great idea for a fundraiser. And in my head, I was thinking about, I had gone, when I was a journalist here, I had gone to Karpaty and I had been at this like rehabilitation program for women and their children whose fathers, husbands had been killed since 2014. And that memory was like stuck in my head of like these, specifically like these two young twins and their mom in this church. And I was just thinking like, when the violence of war ends, you have all of these like long-term effects, right? So I wanted to do something to help those people because this was pre full-scale invasion, right? A few days before. And then I posted on my Instagram, and I think I printed the stickers first. And then I posted a picture of it on my Instagram, and I said like, hey, if anybody wants to buy one of these, it's like $10 and we're going to donate the money to Help Us Help, which is the organization that held that rehab center. And then it was like, I remember the first night I posted it at like 11 p.m. or 10 p.m. And then people started messaging me and they're like, yes, I want it. So then I basically set up a website in 30 minutes where people could just buy the single sticker. And then there was 2 orders before I went to sleep. And then the next day where there was $1,000. And I was like, wow, this is crazy. Like, I thought it would be like 500, like maybe $500, right? And it was $1,000 on the first day. So I was like blown away. And then the next day it was $5,000. And I had 100 stickers and I started to panic because I was like, I don't even know how to ship all of these things. Like, what am I going to do? Right? Like, do I like buy postage stamps? Like, how do I do all this stuff? And then it just started to like go really, really, really viral from that point, because I guess like I had been posting my information, my, you know, like humorous analysis, let's call it. And then people had this symbol. And I think that people wanted the symbol because it was a way to show the world, their community, that they supported Ukraine, right? Like, it's one thing to like donate to an organization, to a cause, but it became, I don't want to say this lightly, but it became like you're like showing support for your favorite team, right? Like Saint Javelin became kind of like a symbol that you put on your car or you have, you know, whatever on your laptop. And it was like, I support Ukraine. And then it just like kind of like went crazy viral.
When did you start the Instagram page? I actually genuinely don't know this.
Honestly, I don't remember. I don't remember.
Also before?
Like, this is a terrible answer, but I don't remember at all. No, it must have been like, because it was from my personal, and then I started the website, not thinking that like anything was going to happen. And then I think probably once like the website, once people started buying it, I was like, oh, I guess I should like, I don't know, take this more seriously, right?
So now it's sort of Saint Javelin is a company and an advocacy page right now, basically, for Ukraine on Instagram, Twitter, and several other platforms that it exists. And I think a lot of people at the beginning thought that it was an NGO. Why did you decide not to go the NGO route, but more a business route with the social, entrepreneurial aspects to it?
I think for me, it was like a long-term strategy. Like, how do I, like, yes, you can donate to things, but like, I thought if we can create products that people want to buy or like need to buy, whatever, there was no like crazy strategy at the beginning. I figured like maybe you can create something that lasts a long time and like contributes over time. So I looked at like companies like Patagonia, like social enterprises, and figured like maybe if we can do something that is like its own engine, it can be around for a long time. So like when it was just the sticker, people then started to say, oh, my country is contributing this. Can you make like a saint for whatever, for my country's contribution? And then people started to say like, can you make a hat? Can you make a shirt? Can you make all these types of things? So then April 2022 is when I came here. March 2022, I went to Poland, but I didn't come to Ukraine yet. March 2022, I went to Poland with a different organization, and I was like helping coordinate whatever aid and stuff like that into Ukraine. But April, I decided I'm coming here and I'm going to try to figure out like, okay, if there's all this demand for Saint Javelin products, like how do we make it here? And that's when it was like, okay, let's turn this into a business, because at that point it was just like a fundraiser.
Mm-hmm. And when you decided to make it a business, did you have a plan of what's going to happen if the war like stops tomorrow? Like,
no.
Do you know right now, like if everything finishes, what's going to happen to Saint Javelin? Like,
it felt like a responsibility. You know, like I understood that I had created something that was like beyond my understanding of like what should it become, where is it going, and all this kind of stuff. And I just kind of figured, okay, so let's turn this into an organization that can last a long time. Like, let's try to bring like the maximum economic benefit of the organization into Ukraine. So then we started to look for suppliers in Ukraine and differentiate products and like focus on the quality of the products and stuff like that.
You were sanctioned by Russia in 2022. What it meant for you personally?
I think it was like April 2022. So I woke up and I had messages from some friends, and they were like, hey, did you see the news? Mm-hmm. And I remember looking at the list of the people that were sanctioned, and like it became, you know, I'm just a regular dude, right? So I wasn't part of like some large organization. I wasn't a politician or whatever. And I looked at the list of people and I thought to myself like, oh, you know, this person is a member of a political party. This person is a member of like a large organization. I'm on this list now. So like, obviously I've created something that has like garnered a lot of attention and like put focus on me. Right. So it was weird. It wasn't like shocking. It was just, okay, I guess people are looking at what we're doing and seeing that it's actually having an effect, right? Enough of an effect that like somebody wants to prevent me from going to their country. So.
Do you think the effect was at that point because it was generating this attention in terms of informational warfare, or like specifically just because you were donating from the sales to helping Ukraine? Like, which one do you think was more triggering for them, for the Russians to sanction you?
I think by that point we probably had like 100,000 followers on Instagram, but what was happening is that we were going like hyper viral. So we had a lot of like, you know, BBC was covering us, and like I think I did CNN at that point and whatever. So I assume it was the fact that we kind of became like a voice for Western audiences of, yes, there was like obviously, you know, in-depth articles from BBC, Washington Post, New York Times, stuff like that. But we were the ones that were like kind of leading the voice on social. And I guess people understand the power of social and like the effect it can have on a wide scale. So I remember we only had like 100,000 followers, but we were reaching like tens of millions of people. So like big celebrities were sharing our posts and everything. So I guess it must have like caught people's attention, and they looked at the information side and said, okay, well, this is, you know, not to our liking.
What do you think made that content so special that it was reaching so many people? Specifically also, I think, for foreigners, because, I mean, a lot of, memes and things were going viral here inside Ukraine, but some of Ukrainians don't even know, like, the stuff that Saint Javelin sometimes, like, put out and became wildly kind of known among, like, Western audience.
When it started, it was like primarily an American audience because of the name, right? It was like I guess like you could say a tribute to the Javelin, because the Javelin was the first item that was given to Ukraine in like large quantities. And like it was known that if Russia ever launched a full-scale invasion, they would do it with tanks, and the Javelin was like the item that could give Ukraine the best chance, I guess, with like a low effort from the West in terms of support, right? So first it was Americans, and it was like Americans caught on, Canadians caught on, Europeans caught on, but it was all like English speakers, right? And I guess it was like, it was hard to find, Ukrainians had tons of memes going around, right? Like super funny stuff, but there wasn't just like another resource of what we were doing. And we were sharing funny stuff. We were, funny, like, it's weird to say funny, but like we were basically like cheering on these Ukrainian soldiers through our memes, through our videos. We were showing like all of the stuff that's kind of at that point, people don't know how to find it, through Telegram videos and Twitter and all this kind of stuff, which now is super easy to find. But like I knew how to find that stuff, and I was just showing the things that I thought were like most, most important on a daily basis, right? So it was either like, I would do something as simple as like taking a screenshot of a newspaper article and like sharing that, or I would like show a video, and it wasn't always funny. It could be like emotional or inspirational or inspiring, or like just straight up making fun of the Russian military. And I think the stuff that really resonated with American soldiers, which at that point was like the biggest audience for Saint Javelin, was the fact that Ukrainians, who a lot of people discounted, were showing the world that the Russian military was basically like a farce compared to what they were saying they're the second best military in the world, and they were basically shown that they could be defeated by an army that had like so much less resource, right? So I think that all those things combined, people just looked at our page and said like, I'm going to open this every day and I'm going to like find out about what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think I also like really liked kind of the sarcastic tone and very like, unserious tone specifically directed at Russia, especially at the start, because obviously a lot of people were just scared and there was like a lot of tension, and I feel like humor was helping to sort of ease that tension and boost people's morale at the beginning, especially when everybody was like very stressed. And it was the same thing that was happening here in Ukraine. Russia has used memes, and we know it for a fact now, to like meddle in US elections and to spread disinformation, to spread their like propaganda narratives. What do you think they feel when they see sort of like their weapon being used against them?
Honestly, part of it to me was like, I had seen for so long how effective they were at disinformation, right? So I think what resonated with people was the fact that I didn't try to like dissect their disinformation. I just straight up was like making fun of them. And I think that was, for social media, it was like a refreshing approach, right? Because in newspaper articles, I don't want to discount what journalists do, but like you read 1,000 words and it's like, sometimes you still are confused about what's happening. I guess with what I was doing, I was just like cutting straight through the lies that they were showing, right? And I was doing it in a funny way. So people were like, oh, wow, this is a completely different thing. And like the thing about war, conflict that is immediately taboo is humor. So unless you've been in one or like part of one, as I was as a journalist, right? Like you understand that a lot of people on the front are using humor to basically like, it's like a psychological, you know, tool to just, you're in this horrible situation and you basically start to just come up with like the worst jokes, but they're really, really funny, right? And I was like, I guess I was doing that as well. And people, you know, American soldiers, European soldiers, whoever, they understood that as well. So they took a liking to it. It wasn't for everybody. You know, some people thought like the jokes I was making were like disgusting. But
did people call you propaganda ever?
All the time. Yeah. Still. Yeah. CIA funded, like all this kind of stuff. Yeah.
Wow. And I mean, CIA, like NATO funded as well, because you actually spoke at the NATO conference, and they invited you to talk about psychological operations, and to share your approach, which was interesting because other people at the panel were like these, you know, generals, professional NATO communicators, members of NATO country governments, and you sort of this like private actor who's full like you know business and company doesn't even like do this like full time. It's just like several pages where you like post in your free time. What do you think is the role of private individuals like yourself in countering propaganda or disinformation, or even creating this positive sort of propaganda?
That's a good question. So basically, I think that we do what they can't do. Like we put out messages in a way that like they're professional, you know, diplomatic organizations, let's say, right? So we're not. Like we just are who we are, and you know, there's no like guidelines or like protocols. There's no like, you know, 50-year history of this is how you're supposed to act. And I think that I know that we do things, we share memes, we share videos, we put out messages that they absolutely cannot, because it's like it's too crazy for them to do it. But the way social media works is like those messages resonate hugely, right? So at that conference, I was showing one of the things that we did, which was a video on Prigozhin, and it was like completely insane, right? And I remember, you know, there's this picture of me next to this French general, and he's looking at me like, who is this idiot? And like, why is he here? And then I showed this video that was like so crazy. And
what was the video about?
It was basically, I think it was like when Prigozhin did his, you know, basically like tried to attack Putin. It was a whole like AI generated scenario, like a script of like all of that whole event. But it was insane. Like you can watch it on our channel and you can see like how crazy it is. And now picture a room of like 500 NATO people, like in suits, generals, and I'm on stage showing this video, and it's silence for like 30 seconds, like dead silence. And I'm sitting there like, oh, this was a bad idea. And then one person laughed, and it was like a very senior person. And then once that person laughed, it was like, oh, everybody can share how they actually feel. And then like by the end, everybody was really, really laughing hard.
Yeah. So do you think big official organizations like NATO should collaborate with people who do such things like privately on official level?
My personal belief, I've never been asked that question, but it's a really good question. Like if you're serious about spreading your messages, why not? You know, like use every avenue that you can. Because unfortunately, the way that those large organizations, whether it's NATO or the UN or whoever, like it can be very boring. It can be very dry. It doesn't like resonate. And the reason why is because they have like so many layers of approvals that things have to go through, right? So the things that we do, they would never get approved by them. But I don't know if they have any appetite to collaborate with people like us. I have no idea.
And when you said that people call you propaganda all the time, I think a part of that comes from the fact that it's a very sort of like one-sided stance on this specific war. How do you feel about it? Do you feel like there should be any neutrality in this? Or did you also at the beginning knew immediately that this would be like a one-sided effort on your side?
Neutrality is a interesting subject, because if the reality of what's happening is so blatant, like, why are you trying to find some like benefit of the doubt for the other side? That's how I look at some of the articles or the headlines where it's like, Russia says, and followed by a complete lie. To me, it's like, why did you even publish that? Because you're publishing a headline that is just, it's disinformation in and of itself, because what Russia has said is a lie, right? So I don't know. I think that neutrality is just like, how do you look at a situation which is so black and white? And I think that, like, to go back to your earlier question, like, why did Saint Javelin resonate? Because it was so black and white with people, right? It was like, go back to conflicts like post World War II, there was always, especially if America was involved, it was like, should they be there? Should they not be there? Like, what is the ultimate purpose here? You look at Iraq, stuff like that. But with this, it was like, Ukraine is a sovereign nation, and then the Russians invade. And like, what else is there to discuss? Like, what, they say that they have their problems or whatever, but like, they're the ones that are using weapons to invade you, right? So neutrality was always, like, how do you claim to be neutral if you're making an excuse for them? That's how I always saw it, right? So it was always just a confusing argument to me. Like, how is that neutrality? That's just lying, basically.
Yeah, and I think what you said, like, repeating Russian propaganda as a part of like news article is something that, unfortunately, it's like a trap that a lot of journalists fall into still, especially like, if we remember cases like when Kakhovka Dam was blown by Russians and the media was reporting, well, Ukraine says this and Russia says this. So it's basically like reporting, pointing fingers without providing any nuance. And there's other ways in which, Russian propaganda has been trying to get specifically to the minds of people in the West who are responsible for then, supporting or not supporting their government in sending aid to Ukraine. Why do you think, if there's been so much talk about, disinformation, Russian propaganda, needing to counter it, why do you think it's been so effective, if you think it's been effective so far?
Why has Russian propaganda been effective? I think it was very ineffective at the beginning. And then you combine it with time. Mm-hmm. And
at the beginning of 2022? At
the beginning of 2022, yeah. So I think it was like wildly effective from 2014, and like that was my frustration in the origin of Saint Javelin. It was like looking at all these things that they would say from 2014, like MH17, they basically, like, it was so obvious what happened, but then you have to go through this like years long investigation to really debunk, and then you had like all these debunking organizations that became a thing afterwards, because it was like a full-time job to look at what the Russians were saying and like get to the bottom of it. And it's frankly like it's just a waste of time, because all they're doing is like, they don't care if you believe what they're saying. They just care that you don't believe what the truth is. So they're just putting out like a million different messages, like with MH17, it was like Carlos, or there was bodies on the plane or whatever it might be. So I think that their whole strategy worked from 2014 to honestly like 2022, and then early part of 2022, people just didn't believe it because it was so black and white. But then I truly believe that like they ramped up their efforts because they saw that the Ukrainian narrative was finally winning. And then time, like you add the amount of time that they've been attacking into the equation, and like people's frustration that this is still going on, like as frustrated and like tired, exhausted as people in Ukraine are, Americans are basically being pumped this information all the time that like you know Zelensky's spending billions of dollars like shopping and stuff like that, and like those ideas, as crazy as they are, they resonate with people, right? Because Americans are very, very divided right now too. But they don't just resonate in the US, they also resonate like across Europe. They resonate with Canadians. And I think it's just like a matter of the amount of time that this has been going on, which also goes back to like if Western countries had supported Ukraine more aggressively at the beginning, like you wouldn't be in this situation, right? Like the Russian narrative would have been finished. They would have like stopped trying to attack because they would have realized, okay, there's no hope of invading this country, right? But the longer it drags out, the more time they have to produce these narratives and like take shape in people's heads and make people believe the things that they want to believe. And they're not making you believe any single thing. They're just making you believe anything else.
Yeah, I know that a lot of people ask you this question, especially when you're in Ukraine, like, what should we do to counteract it, to try to stop the spread of just, you know, lies and misinformation that comes from Russian side and infiltrates the minds of especially like Americans, Canadians, like large NATO countries that are so essential. And you're, as someone, I know you're not like an expert on disinformation, which a lot of people think you are, but as someone who, you know, is there physically, you live in Canada, live in Toronto, and work so much in Ukraine, sees what this war has been to Ukraine in these 10 years, because you worked in Ukraine before, from 2015 to 2018, and now you're working, like your organization is also like the company is registered in Ukraine as well. Do you see maybe what kind of strategies we as Ukrainians and also the international community who's continuing to be like pro-Ukraine and willing to advocate, what can we do to just, you know, try to hold on and counteract Russian propaganda in the future?
I'll be honest, like I wish I had the answer. Like you said, like people ask me all the time, right? And there was a period of time where I thought that what we were doing was super effective. I think it was super effective at that time, right? Because it was like, it was just forget about what they're saying, trying to debunk it, just discredit it right off the top with humor. I think humor resonates very widely, but genuinely the problem now is, I think that like, I don't want to like only talk about the problem, but like, is there a solution? I don't know. But the problem is basically you have so much time that this has been happening. And in the meantime, you've had all of these other things that have started, right? Like conflicts elsewhere. You have like crazy storms, just the most recent example. You have like political turmoil all over the place, like, you know, huge changes across Europe. So people's attention just gets sucked into all these other things. And there was a period of time where all of the attention, like literally all of the world's attention was on Ukraine. But I remember I was doing a CNN interview and they cut my segment short because Roe versus Wade, the abortion law, was like repealed that day. And it hit me like, oh, the attention will not be solely on Ukraine anymore. That was like the first trickle of like, oh, there's a different story happening, right? And now like I don't know, it's like, it's such a difficult question to answer. So part of, I guess, what we've tried to do is like share personal stories, like emotional stories, right? To like make people, I think some journalists do it really well as well, to make people see that the people who are being attacked here, living through this, are just like you back home, right? They might have been, we made this book, right? And it was like ordinary people who did extraordinary things to defend their country. And the idea is like, you have a mechanic who has to go to war, never expected to be a soldier or anything like that, but they just did what they had to do. And like, imagine you living in Toronto or in New York or Ohio or whatever, and you had to go through that. Like, can you picture that? So like maybe the solution is to continue to try to do that and like make people understand, hey, these are just normal people. Like, they didn't want war. Like, but the problem is that those Russian narratives of like, this is NATO sponsored and all this kind of stuff, like it's strong. So I don't want to be negative. It's just, it's a really, really, really hard question. And yeah, I do get asked all the time, but like, I think about it a lot. And I think that telling those personal stories is, I think it's a more effective way than trying to like debunk propaganda from the Russian side. Unfortunately, I'll give you an example of this film that was just shown at the Toronto International Film Festival. So this director who spent 7 years at Russia Today made a film called Russians at War.
Yeah, Anastasia Trofimova.
Yeah, which is a story, I haven't seen it, but I've read all of the reviews about it. It's a story of Russian soldiers who somehow she gained access to without anybody knowing, like magically was able to report on these people and everything. And like, it's showing these guys as just ordinary people who are like caught up in this bigger thing that they have no control over. And like, oh, she says she didn't see any like war crimes. The guys say like they've never seen any war crimes, all this kind of stuff, right?
In
and
7 months.
Yeah, it's just like this kind of like, oh, how did this happen? Like, where did this all come from? And it like, I think I see the Russians doing that a lot, where it's just like, this is part of a bigger thing that like we're not political people, like we're just trapped in this like crazy thing, right?
Just ordinary people.
Yeah, we're ordinary people, or we're not political people. Like we have no control over like what's happening and stuff like that. And
people in the West believe it.
People in the West believe it. They felt sorry for those guys. Like they watched that film, and it's like designed to make you feel sorry for those guys, right? So, how do you get around that? Like, there was a lot of people who tried really hard to get Canadians to understand that like, this is a propaganda film. This was made by a person who spent 7 years, from 2014 to 2018, till 2022. She was at Russia Today. She learned from like the most effective propaganda organization machine like in history, right? How to build propaganda. And then she basically started, in her interviews when the film came out and she started being attacked, it was like, I wasn't part of it. Like, I wasn't in Ukraine. I was like in the Middle East, I was doing different work. But it's like, you worked in that machine of like a historic level of propaganda was created, right? Like, what that organization was about. So of course she was very effective at understanding, how do you make this film? Like, what should it look like? How should people respond to it and stuff like that, right? And how do you counter that? Like, we tried hard to make people aware of the facts, and then Canadian journalists were writing these articles that were like, no, the Ukrainians are wrong. Like, this is about freedom of speech. It's like, how do you make people understand the difference between freedom of speech and propaganda, right? And unfortunately, like, that film was shown, and there was a lot of like very sympathetic articles to her and to the film saying, this is a beautiful film, like it tells the story of these Russians. People in their articles would say it's an anti-war film, and they would take time to say like, we're pro-Ukrainian, but I think the purpose of that film was to make you feel bad about supporting Ukraine with weapons, because you don't want to kill those ordinary guys, right? You don't want to see them. And
it doesn't show that they kill.
Yeah, it doesn't show that but that's like the effective part of it. It's like, well, you would, next time there's a big ask of weapons, you would think about those guys and be like, but what about those guys who are just caught in this big plot that they're not a part of, and they have to die, right? But like in reality, those guys are taking huge salaries to go and be at war, right? And like they're deciding themselves voluntarily, I'm going to sign up to go kill people because I'm going to get paid to do it. And like that's not being caught in something larger. That's just like you're a bad person.
This is something that a lot of Ukrainians are very frustrated about when we see how it almost feels like some media outlets from outside, or these like filmmakers, they almost like ran out of stories, or they don't make an effort to find stories here in Ukraine, and they go for, oh, like maybe I can find the story of like a Russian Ukrainian couple and write about them, and the ending will be like, oh, I hope there will be peace one day, and these two brotherly nation will be again like loving and living in peace. And then there's a lot of these I don't know, like some sort of festivals or art organization that invite like Russian artists to talk about how it's like not their fault, and they're doing their thing, and they're not a part of this like war machine, or they don't have this responsibility. Why do you think there is such a strong like willingness to sympathize with perpetrators of this war, especially in the West?
I think like the West has a fascination with Russia. Like, Russia's been, if you grow up, like it's a really interesting question, because me growing up in Canada, I remember elementary school, when you're a kid, you learn about the Nazis and how evil the Nazis were. But like, there wasn't that much about the Soviets, right? Like there wasn't that much about like Stalin and all the things he did. There was never like the equation of the they did equally evil things, right? So there's like this, I don't know, like this romanticism about Russia, and like it was like the enemy of the West, but like a lot of people also, they were like fascinated by it, right? So I think when it comes to journalism, media, there's like the desire to go and like learn like who are these people, right? Like what motivates them, and like show their side of the story. Which I don't know, like did that happen with ISIS? Like were people like desperate to go and like show like the human side of ISIS and stuff like that? I don't know. Like it's kind of stupid, right? So but it perpetuates, like it continues, and it's like it really is like this. I've had conversations with friends back home who like argued with me that the Russians weren't deliberately targeting civilians in Ukraine. And I was like,
which is the funniest thing to say.
Yeah, I was like, dude, like I have some understanding of this, right? But I don't know, like people have their own opinions, and like they form them, and they're very stubborn as well. So I don't know, like I guess people see the Russians and like they can't like imagine that people can be so evil, like I don't know. It's kind of bewildering to me, because I have the experience of like being here and like seeing these things, right? So I know that like humans are capable of being like supremely evil, but it's hard to wrap your head around like how evil people can be, right? Like when there's stories about like the mass rapes and all these kinds of things, like the murders, even the videos from Mariupol, like you see the film 20 Days in Mariupol, and like you see the evidence of it, right? But it's still like so shocking that people can do that to other people, that I guess people don't want to believe it's true. So
yeah, and then I think Russian, this psyop machine just does everything to make sure that people like this argument of like Russians are just people and there and not, and that was the problem with the film Russians at War. It doesn't go to the full sentence of like Russians are just people who do these horrific things to other people, because they just do this and they don't even like realize. And I think that was as well my problem with the whole discussion around the film, because Ukrainians obviously were trying to wake up the Westerners who were like supporting it are saying that it's an anti-war film by drawing a parallel with like World War II and Nazis and, you know, those Nazi propagandists who were doing kind of the same thing at that time. And, you know, we read a lot of books about now people who are committing, you know, all the genocidal crimes against Jews. And that's the main, like, scariest point, that it's the, you know, the ordinarity of evil, that it's just somebody who can call their wife back home after they've, you know, in our reality, launched several missiles that hit, like, a kindergarten in Ukraine, a residential building, and they pretend like they just, you know, did their normal workday. And with this film specifically, with Russians at War, the unique part about it as well, that Canada actually funded it. And as somebody who worked in media and, you know, like you are in those journalistic circles still, how do you think that it happened that this kind of film was able to get funding from an organization that also, like, it has like the money of Canadian taxpayers? Like, it's you know, an organization that is funded by the government and then gives these grants to films, and one of these films turns out something that actually helps to promote Russian narratives inside Canada and around the world.
I heard about how it happened. So they told them that they were making a film about Russian protesters. And then they were able to start the process, which is like, I've been through that process. I've gone through like funding, blah, blah, blah. It's not easy. So she or they, whoever was part of like the original, you know, pitch proposal, they said that they were making a film about protesters, which is a hugely different film. Right. And then I guess, I'm just guessing, I guess what happened is that they got like an initial agreement, batch of money. Maybe they showed some footage, like maybe they had a trailer and they said like, this is the film that we're making. And then like they get, you know, the agreement, the momentum starts on the film. And then, it slowly becomes a completely different thing. Then the people who agreed to it are like slowly convinced that, oh yeah, this is a better film. So like my understanding is that's how it worked out. And the crazy part to me is that this woman worked for 7 years at Russia Today, and then she was able to get a job. So before she made the film, she was able to get a job at the CBC, which is like our national broadcaster. It's like the BBC, right? How? Blows my mind.
It's important to know that Russia Today is sanctioned right now by most of Western countries, and it's recognized as a Russian full-on.
It literally, the Biden administration said like, this is Russian intelligence. It's not a media company, right? Which has been the whole time.
It's like everybody knew it.
Yeah. So when all this, when the movie was coming out, I say movie because it's like not a documentary.
Yeah.
When it was coming out, that was when like the Tenet media thing was also coming out, where these people in the U.S. were indicted, Canadians actually. So I think it was a Canadian woman and an American woman were indicted for taking 10 million from Russian intelligence to propagate messages around YouTube, to pay these YouTube influencers and whatever to make videos about like anti-Ukraine videos alongside other videos, and like mixing it all in and making it all look natural, right? And they were getting like 100,000 per video. But with her thing, it was just shocking to me, and it still is shocking to me, and it still is like, you know, I don't come at it from just the perspective of Saint Javelin. Like, I have friends who are journalists who like can't wrap their head around how this person who spent 7 years at an organization that if you spend one day there, you're discredited from journalism. Like, you should know what that organization is. And then she was able to go work at the CBC, and then she was able to like freelance with Washington Post and New York Times, and then like my understanding as well is that like people at the CBC when she was there were like helping her figure out how do you get like films made, because she was a filmmaker at Russia Today, and her claim is that she was at Russia Today documentary, which somehow is a completely separate thing from Russia Today. But then evidence came out that she was actually with, I don't remember the name of the woman, but the woman who was in charge of like basically kidnapping Ukrainian children and like transporting them to Russia, right? So she was with her in 2014. The director said that she was never working on Ukraine matters at all, which is obviously false, right? So like there's multiple red flags in all of her claims. And like I said before, the crazy part is that like all of this has been brought to the forefront, and journalists, like Canadian media, like columnists mostly, have just avoided it, swept it aside, and been like, no, this is about freedom of expression. When the film was shown at Toronto International Film Festival, the CEO of the film festival, I think his name's Cameron Bailey, when he was introducing it, he completely neglected to like mention anything about her past and history and whatever. Like, if you're going to show this film, like, tell the context of what it is, right? And also, my understanding is that the film doesn't have a single mention of what the Russians have done. It's like this cinema verite thing, right? Where it's just like, I'm going to shoot what I see, and that's it. But also, it's her narration. So she's like guiding the viewer through it, but never tells the viewer, like, never even has a subtitle of like, the Russians have killed X amount of people in Ukraine, you know, blah, blah, blah. All these kinds of like facts that are obviously relevant, right?
Well, as a filmmaker who like works in this, you know, topic, she also said specifically she like didn't have time to see 20 Days of Mariupol, which is the biggest, you know, documentary film on the war.
Yeah. Not only that, she said that she didn't like that other film that was shown in Venice by the Ukrainian director. She said that she didn't like it.
Intercepted, I think. Yeah. That's the
no, a different one. Songs of something like that.
The other Ukrainian,
which I really want to see. But she said that the ending didn't appeal to her because it showed Russian children doing like, I don't know, I think it was like Russian children doing like some sort of propaganda show or something like that, like dressed in like military uniforms. And she said that that was like showing Russians as evil. So clearly, like, she's stated multiple times in her articles, like, what, it's very obvious what her stance is, right? And the idea that this film was made with Canadian taxpayer money is just like mind-blowing.
You said that a lot of Canadian journalists or columnists who were sort of, you know, discussing the scandal around this film swept away the fact that she worked at RT for 7 years. Why do you think is that? Like, what's the point of not like highlighting is that information? Maybe, is it like maybe tell something about them?
Yeah.
Like, are they embarrassed of this fact?
Yeah. I like, there's no other reason why you would want to leave that out apart from like it doesn't fit your narrative of what you're trying to say, right? So like op-ed columnists, which aren't journalists, they're just like people who write essays, but they get space in large publications, right? They were the ones that were saying that they were just leaving it out. They were making it seem like it wasn't an important thing. They would actually highlight that she worked at CBC and whatever to give her more credibility, to give the film more credibility, but then leave out anything that gave it, like, that took the credibility away, right? But like, if you're going to write an article about that, and there was a couple other people that did write good pieces about it, I think like you lead with, hey, this film was made by somebody who worked at this thing for 7 years.
Obviously, Anastasia Trofimova, she's Russian. She has Canadian citizenship right now, and that's how they try to also kind of defend that it's not a Russian woman who got Canadian funding. It's a Canadian citizen, but obviously her background is very much Russian, in Russia, working for Russian disinformation machine. But before, especially before 2022, before the full-scale invasion, from 2014, a lot of these large media companies like New York Times, Washington Post had opened their bureaus in Moscow, or they've had them open since, the fall of the USSR, but specifically after 2014, because they needed to report on what was going on. And most of the journalists, like Western journalists who are from these English-speaking countries, they went to stay in Moscow, and then, be this Russia-Ukraine expert or like report from there. You went to Ukraine and you spent time as a journalist, as a freelance journalist in Ukraine, covering specifically also what was going on in the east of Ukraine, the Russian invasion. Did you ever think about going to Russia yourself? I know you have friends who went there. Why did you decide to pick, I would say, like a less popular at that time post to report from?
I actually tried to make a film about the KHL, which is the Russian hockey league. So it's interesting because like I went through the process and was just denied the opportunity to like make the film that I wanted to make. And my concept was like, this league is like super corrupt and like just insane. And it was actually like, I still maintain that it was a great concept for a film. And I had like a hockey player, professional hockey player, and it was like it was going to be a Canadian who's like in his first year in the league. And it was like, it was a good concept. But I think that, first of all, like media organizations, to be fair, have like struggled financially, right? I think New York Times is like doing much better now. So maybe that's why they've decided to like open a bureau or whatever here. But they had like finite resources, and Russia was the historically like big enemy and the big story and all that kind of stuff, right? But so most people wanted that posting, like the Moscow bureau or whatever. Why did I come here? Just, I don't know. It was just like my parents are both born in Poland. My dad's Ukrainian. For me, it was just like the place I wanted to be. I didn't have literally any contacts when I arrived. And then I was able to just like find my stories and find my footing and like develop my trajectory. Like I was covering drones and stuff at like a very early stage. Now it's kind of crazy to look at the stories I did back then because it's like, it's so important now, right? But Russia was never like, it was never like so super interesting to me. But I think that for other journalists, it's like, that's where bigger jobs are, more budget for stories, more attention. The problem is, what I've seen is that you have journalists who spent a lot of time there, and like a lot of them were very wrong in early 2022 because they were like, they felt that they had this understanding of Russia and like Russian politics and like the thinking and everything, and they were completely dead wrong about what happened. They didn't believe it was possible, right? The guys who actually highlighted what was about to happen were all like the open source intelligence, OSINT people. That's the people that I was like paying attention to, because they were just showing the Russians wouldn't put this many vehicles together if they didn't have like the intention. So I think that a lot of those people, they had their preconceived notions, which were built on like all of their contacts that they developed in Moscow and across Russia. And then when they come here, it's like a satellite. It's like a smaller, and immediately in your head, it's kind of like amateur hour, right? And you like don't take it as seriously, or it's kind of like a vacation or whatever it is. But if you're not here all the time, like you don't develop an understanding of what this country is, right? And like a great example of that is military analysts. You had all these military analysts who like deeply understood the Russian military, or thought they did, and paid no attention to the Ukrainian military. And then it's like everybody thought that the Ukrainians had no chance whatsoever. And in reality, it's like they showed the world that the Russian military was like a fraction of what all these people thought it was. So yeah, I mean, unless you're here all the time, like you don't know what's happening.
Yeah, that was actually, I was going to ask the question how it shaped sort of like the dominance of Western Moscow-based journalists, how it shaped the understanding of the Russian invasion of Ukraine overall, because I think the problem was not only that they didn't have these contacts like here or like understanding of Ukrainian military, they also like really, I think a lot of them fell in the trap of like, yeah, Ukrainian and Russians are brothers. They're culturally very close. And they had zero idea of the mood inside Ukraine before the full-scale invasion. So it was interesting to see a lot of them being like so, like shocked and everything. When we talked about sort of like countering Russian disinformation, you talked about like personal stories and how this is something that Saint Javelin tries to rely right now and how important it is. And we see that Russian propaganda kind of like is doing that in the US right now. You mentioned the hurricane, and I think like Saint Javelin has shared a meme about how like there was somebody who was saying like, oh, like Florida should be renamed to Ukraine. Maybe that way it will receive the aid from the government. And obviously Ukrainians and everybody else is like laughing, like, what are you going to shoot the NASAMS or like Patriots at the hurricane? But this is interesting because you see how it's something that is like a pain of those people, is like a vulnerable or triggering spot for them, and they sort of just tie Ukraine somehow as if it's at fault. And then when we were talking off the camera, you were talking about your experience in Lithuania recently, visiting the conference on disinformation, and how Ukrainian activists had a very interesting approach to convincing some of the DC lawmakers to pass the aid. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Why do you think it's such a like clever sort of approach, specifically that story with?
Yeah, I'm sure that like I can share the story because they shared it at the conference. But so basically the story was that the 61 billion that was passed earlier this year, I think it was earlier this year, aid package to Ukraine by the Americans, it was held up. So basically, like, it was understood that Congress and the Senate, whoever needed to pass it, like, it was going to pass. But Mike Johnson, who was or still is this, I think he still is the Speaker of the House, he had to like bring it into the Congress for the vote first, and he just didn't do it because he's one of these MAGA guys, right? So he delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed. So the strategy, which ultimately was part of like the equation that worked to finally get him to bring it to the table and bring the vote and get this approved, the strategy was figure out like what is important to him. And what was important to him is he's a deeply religious person. He's an evangelical. So they basically found out where's his church, and they put up a billboard outside of his church with his favorite Bible verse. That was something like the time is now, or something to that effect, right? And it was like I think it had a picture of a church, of an evangelical church that had been bombed in Ukraine. And like eventually when that organization was able to have a meeting with him, they walked in and the Mike Johnson's people were like, oh, you guys are the billboard people. So like they remembered it, right? Like it had some effect. So
when you mentioned evangelicals, I wanted to ask you, how do they feel about Saint Javelin as a symbol? And
I had an old man. He came up to me when we were at the Ukrainian festival in Toronto, and he started yelling at me, basically being like, you're sacrilegious. And I was just like, dude, please, like, see it for more than that, right? But a lot of people were upset about it at the very, very beginning and saying like it's sacrilegious, and then we put up the mural, and then that was like a big thing here.
Yeah, because the Ukrainian Council of Churches basically like denounced it as like blasphemous, and like, oh, like, who allowed it, and they actually painted over the halo.
Yeah.
Which was very interesting as well to see, because
which I still like. I guess that they were trying to like make it not holy.
Yeah.
But you should just paint over the javelin. I don't know, like, it just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, that was a really interesting case, because like it's literally a symbol of like the biggest, I think, like support, especially abroad, and the halo actually had like Trezub's Ukrainian, so they painted over it, which again just shows like the I guess the topic of the church here has been also really, tense with the Moscow Orthodox Church still being present in Ukraine and operating, and basically Ukrainian intelligence just realized that it's a bunch of like spy networks, and they full on were preparing in a lot of these towns, especially in the east, to sort of greet Russian soldiers. And there's all that evidence, but it's such a like still manipulated topic abroad, because you keep hearing politicians saying that, oh, Zelensky banned Christianity in Ukraine. Do you see a lot of that in Canada? And do people even understand, in your opinion, what's the core issue here with the church?
Honestly, like, Canada, this is just my experience. Like, I don't think Canadians are like that deeply religious. Maybe like further west, but I don't think it's like on the same level as the US, especially when you go south. Like, you see these billboards in like the south in Florida and stuff like that for churches and like anti-abortion, and like, you kind of have a sense of like how those people are going to vote and like what you're going to think about and stuff like that. But in Canada, I don't think it has like that big of an impact, honestly. I don't know if maybe diaspora people would have an understanding of like the difference between the Russian church and the Ukrainian church, and like the impact of the Russian church and stuff like that. But on a whole, like, people read those stories for sure. And like, I can see who's going to believe that narrative that the Ukrainians are attacking, like, innocent Russian churches and priests and all that kind of stuff. They don't even
say that it's Russian churches. They just say that Ukrainians attacking religion,
yes.
As if we're full on going just, like U.S. times. Sorry, not U.S. USSR times when, they just banned all religion.
Well, like the, I can't remember, Gonzalo Libra or something like that. There was an American guy who was like imprisoned here, and you had guys like...
because he was also like working specifically to spread disinformation.
Yeah, like, he was in prison for a reason.
Yeah.
But American talking heads like David Sachs and stuff like that, like Tucker Carlson, like, they pile onto that and they catch it and they just like spread it like crazy. And unfortunately, like, obviously they do it without context, and they do it for a reason, to make people believe in like what they're saying, right? That like Ukraine is not democratic, which I hear often. Ukraine's not a democratic country, which is like crazy to me. But they say, look what Ukrainians are doing to like innocent churches and priests, and like Americans, putting them in prison and stuff like that. And unfortunately, if like all you're reading is like the headline or a tweet or whatever, like, it stays in your head, and it's effective. Yeah, like when you mentioned David Sachs, I immediately thought about Elon Musk and what he did with his purchase of Twitter, and basically turning it into this machine of just disinformation and just like, lies and everything. Did you see an impact on Twitter? Because Saint Javelin was, growing on Twitter before that deal was made. And have you noticed any change in the social bubble environment there? Sometimes I worry that we're just like shouting it into an echo chamber, because it's like, at the beginning, I felt like our messages on Instagram as well, like Instagram shut us down how many times? Thankfully, like, we were able to get the account back. But on Twitter, first of all, now you have to pay to like get your messages seen, which is like a Ponzi scheme in and of itself. But I see that very recently big accounts have said that their reach has been like dramatically reduced. And I actually looked at Saint Javelin's, and it hasn't been. Overall, though, like it hasn't been in like the last 30 days, but like overall, we were growing like really rapidly, and then we weren't. And like, I say echo chamber, like I fear that we are shutting into an echo chamber sometimes, because I wonder, like, does our message reach anybody outside of the people who are already like convinced? You know what I mean? I feel like it, I hope it does, because I know that sometimes we share things that like will get seen by a million people in like one tweet, right? Or millions of people. And I have a sense that not all of those people are like convinced or whatever. Like I feel like it's having some impact on how people view the situation here and like the messages that they're receiving and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, the way that Twitter has gone has been insane. Like it's the messages that they're promoting now. I mean, like Elon put his hat into the ring with Trump 2 years ago. He was saying like, this is a community town hall, it's neutral, blah, blah, blah. Now 2 years later, like he's on stage with Trump wearing like the black crazy hat, right? So it happened really fast. And I know a lot of people are leaving Twitter, but I don't know, it feels like if you just leave, like then you're not even like in the ring to fight for the message, right? So yeah, I don't know, it's just been like a really unfortunate thing, because Twitter was such a great resource before.
Yeah, that's very sad for me as well, because I really loved it as a resource and as a social media, specifically for OSINT and other just, you know, news sources. And there's a lot to talk about that, but unfortunately we don't have a lot of time. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about your specific like identity and background, because you already mentioned here that you grew up in a family where both of your parents were born in Poland. Your father was Ukrainian and your mom is Polish, and then they immigrated to Canada and you were born in Canada already. You also told me in the past that your dad's family was relocated forcibly to Poland from the western part of Ukraine during Operational Vistula, which was forcible sort of mass deportation of Ukrainians into the territory of Poland. And it's interesting that, you know, you sort of have these both sort of backgrounds of your identity. How was it growing up in the family, and how much you've heard specifically like Operation Vistula from your dad, and how did it impact who you think you were as a, you know, kind of like person from a cultural perspective, from historical, in a sense of like family history? So when the full-scale invasion broke out, like the one thing that I felt was really heartwarming was the way that Poland and Poles like opened their doors to Ukrainians, right? When the day, I remember the day before, I was telling my dad, like, be prepared because like there's going to be a war, and he brushed me off and said like, you're insane, it's not going to happen. And then the day it happened, I was helping a lot of people like find places in Poland. So I basically like put out a post and I said, hey, if anybody needs a place, like message me, because my dad was in Poland, and then I called him and I was like, you have to help me. So he did a tremendous amount to like help people find homes and like temporary shelter and like get across the border and stuff like that. Like really, like when I look back at that time, there's memories that I have of like him telling me he like picked up children at the border who basically their parents had just, or like the dad had like dropped them off so that the dad could go and fight, and it was just like the kids by themselves, right? Because your dad lives in Przemysl right now.
Yeah. But that's all to say that like that was really heartwarming, because my whole experience in life up to that point was very different. So it was always like Ukrainians versus Poles, and like my mom is 100% Polish. My dad was born in Poland, but was Ukrainian. And he always made the analogy of like, if a cat is born in a dog's home, is it a cat or a dog? Like, whatever. But he raised me Ukrainian. So we always did, you know, like Ukrainian Christmas as well, Ukrainian Easter, like all of these traditions. We went to church. We did all those things, and then simultaneously, like I was also raised by my mom and my babcia, with all the Polish traditions, and like they were never really argumentative about like the Polish nationality, and like my dad was always trying to show me like, here's what it means to be Ukrainian, like Ukrainians have been through so much and all that kind of stuff. But like in a broader community in Canada, it was like it was like weirdly taboo to be both. Like you were almost like bullied for being both, because you were like supposed to be either one or the other, right? So that's why I say when I saw Poland, like Polish people and Ukrainian people coming together immediately, because they had a common enemy, right? An enemy that they both understood for so long, and they both knew what that enemy was. It was like, finally, you guys all are together. I hope that continues. Like, I really, really hope that continues. I see it fracturing, obviously.
Yeah, how do you feel when you see, like, now some, obviously, people in Poland blocking the border, which impacted Saint Javelin as well, as you're trying to move some of the products that you make here in Ukraine to Europe? How do you feel, just from a personal perspective, when you see that divide being, growing since the beginning of 2022 again?
It sucks. Like, and I think it's going back to like what I said earlier, it's like an equation of time. The longer things continue, the more people look for scapegoats for like, they get frustrated. So it goes back to like, if you had just provided more aid at the beginning, like this, we wouldn't be in this scenario, right? But it's really sad to see the effect that time has, and the effect that Russian narratives and like their work in Poland, because they're constantly doing something, right? They're constantly like stirring the pot. Like the blockades were basically farmers who were saying too much grain is coming in from Ukraine, and like, maybe some of those things have like a kernel of truth to them, right? But they exploit them, and they cause people to do things like blockade the border, which has a tremendous effect, right? And like the effect it had on us sucked, obviously. Our goods were blocked for a long time, and like we couldn't get through the border. I think there was a truck driver who died at the border waiting to cross, because it was like 10 days you would sit in your truck waiting to cross, right? And that's horrible, because like, to me, it's always been extremely similar people. Like the languages are extremely similar, the cultural traditions, everything is extremely similar. Like I understand that the past is the past, and like what happened, World War II happened, obviously, and like not to discount all of that, but it's like, just look at each other and like understand that you are very, very similar people, and like there is this common enemy to defeat, right? But yeah, I always go back to like, the longer things drag on, the more those problems can be exploited, right? Those little like frustrations under the surface, they're exploited.
Do you have hope that that sort of, divide that is cracking right now with that blockade and some tensions will be overstepped by Ukrainians and Polish people in the future? Like, and what do you think could help that? Maybe like, I don't know, working through, reflecting on that complicated history. Would you, in your opinion, would that help to just move towards more like just common kind of ground when it comes to specifically also fighting this common enemy that we have, but also creating, like a common future, because Ukraine is going to be a part of European Union, maybe like not right now, maybe in 10 years, but it is a common future for us, and everybody understands that.
Yeah, I think like, probably the story you want to tell is if you go back 20 years when Poland was able to enter the EU, well, I guess it was longer than 20 years. The difference between Poland then and now is so dramatic, like so dramatic, versus the way that Ukraine was like sucked back into the orbit of the Russians, right? And like, all of the things that Ukraine could be at this point if it was able to be in the European Union for all that time. Like, just look at the roads, the highways in Poland versus what they are in Ukraine, right? Like very simple things, but imagine the effect of like great roads and like how much faster things can get around and like how that improves like the economy and people's lives and all that kind of stuff, right? Like, Ukraine will be in the EU, and I think it's very much in Poland's interest to try to like make the relationship work. And I think that there's steps being taken to try to work through the historical, the grievances and the problems and all that kind of stuff. And like, for me, it's much easier to say, just get over it. But it doesn't work that way, right? Like, those moments are such a part of historical identity and like current identity and all that, and like they're taught in schools and everything, and like people really hold on to those things. So I understand why you don't just get over those kinds of things, right? I think that I look at like how much opportunity Poles have had to go and like work in the UK and like earn money and like Germany and like reinvest into Poland, and like the pace that Poland is growing at, it's like the fastest growing economy in Europe. The level of English in Poland right now is astounding because people have like really deeply integrated, right? And people's lives are, not everybody's, I know people complain about the EU, but like on a whole, on average, like Warsaw is crazy compared to what it used to be, right? So people are doing much better, and like I hope that opportunity, I know it will eventually, like it comes here. And like when it does, it's just going to be a bigger benefit for Poland as well. So, I mean, you hope that people think long term and think that way. Unfortunately, like political realities come into the equation, and like people have to try to win elections. So they use stupid narratives.
Divisive strategies.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I hope that we, both Ukraine and Poland, realizes that we're way stronger together, and the only way for a strong future for us is to stay together and support each other as much. Ukraine fighting obviously for its freedom, but if Ukraine falls, we know that Poland is going to be next, and Poland understands it because they increasing their spending on defense and other things. But obviously, it's in their interest to stop Russia at its border with Ukraine, not at the western border of Ukraine and Poland. I think I had a lot of other questions in mind, but obviously we're running out of time. But our final question that we ask everybody, especially those who have been around Ukraine a lot, and I know you've traveled Ukraine quite different places, from like villages in the east in Donetsk region to Kyiv and Lviv and other parts. What is your favorite place in Ukraine that you like love the most, or what is like special for you personally?
Karpaty, which I think is like probably pretty universal. I always heard stories about Karpaty growing up and stuff like that, and then when I finally went, I climbed Haverla a few times and like had special moments there, and like went hiking and camping through the mountains, and I don't know, it's just like it's very very remote, and I like that. Like, it's like rehabilitation basically, right? So easy answer for me.
Yeah, that's really cool. And it's cool that you call it Karpat and not Carpathian Mountains. And I think a lot of people who grew up in Canada, especially around the Ukrainian diaspora, use the actual name that we say here in Ukraine. Well, thank you so much. I hope this interview was interesting, as we said in the beginning, for a lot of Ukrainer viewers. If you want Ukrainer to make more content like this, please support us through Buy Me a Coffee. You can find the link in the bio of this video. Please subscribe to the channel and share this content on social media so more people can see.